Welcome to the Idea Pod, a podcast dedicated to exploring and interrogating professional biomedical and applied ethics here at the University of Leeds. In part 2 of Challenges and Pitfalls of Data Privacy During the Pandemic, we continue our conversation with Andrew Dyson, Managing Partner for DLA Piper's Leeds office. He is also Global Co-Chair of DLA Piper's Data Protection, Privacy and Security Group, Editorial Board Member for the Journal of Data Protection and Privacy, and Visiting Research Fellow in Applied Ethics at the Idea Center. That takes us to our second issue, which is the mobile apps developed for this coronavirus pandemic. I'm talking about symptom trackers and other type of apps. There are a bunch of them that have been developed all over the world. We have some in Singapore, like the Trace Together. We have some in the US called K-Health. We have our own here in the UK with COVID symptom tracker. And generally, the public is concerned about surveillance issues. So, how these apps are taking data location, including aggregated data retention, repurposing the data and the metadata that these apps can get from you. And so an ethical concern has to do with, we can be, in this particular context, be pushed towards collaborating for the public good while risking our privacy, because there is some sort of feeling that, well, I can do my part, I can collaborate with this, I can help solve a problem that we're all facing. And so we might be tempted to contribute, whereas in a normal situation, we might have our doubts in joining this type of apps. So the aim, I think, is to have an ethical balance between public health and, privacy and security issues. So in the case of these mobile apps, I would be interested in you talking a little bit about, the personal data that people are so afraid of, because personal data could be exposed and repurposed. And a lot of people don't really know what personal data is. It is normally associated with, your address, your phone number, your age, but what is exactly personal data from a legal perspective?
Yes, there's so many things in there, aren't there? I mean, I think, let's start with the question of personal data. So personal data from a legal point of view, and this is the reason this is important, is because things like the GDPR all apply only when you're dealing with personal data. They don't deal with anonymized data, which is very important to separate the two. But personal data is certainly defined in the European context as being any information which relates to an individual, from which they can be identified either directly or indirectly. Now that's kind of legalese, but it's basically saying at one extreme it's kind of a contact list with your name and address and phone number and national insurance number. I mean, that's clearly identifiable data that relates to an individual. So that's very obvious. And I don't think anyone's got a problem with that, understanding that that's personal data. But it also has this kind of concept of information which relates to you, or from which you might be identified either directly or indirectly. So that would also include things which are like codes or reference numbers, which, you pick up a national insurance number, but it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. But if it's linked to my tax credits or my behavior somewhere, then of course it does have that relationship back to me, and I'm identifiable from it. And the same is true of things like email addresses. Even if I'm using an alias, ultimately it's still me behind the email address, and I'm still communicating. Or take it another step beyond that, things like IP addresses or device identifiers on mobile phones. These are all identifiers which, an IP address is just a string of numbers when you look at it, and you say, well, is that personal identity? Is that personal data? We would say it almost certainly is, because it's information that links an activity to a device, and that device is linked almost certainly to one or maybe a couple of people at most. So, so they have this very broad concept of personal data, and everything which sits within that remit is then regulated. Important, anything which is anonymous data is not regulated. So you're kind of free to do what you like with anonymous data. It's not regulated. And anonymous data is really information which is stripped of of all identifiable features, but more than that, it cannot in any way, if it's been derived in some way from one of those other personal data sets, you know, it's technically impossible effectively to kind of find out which data set you're talking about and take it back to the personal data. So it's a very high threshold, but if you get there, the reward is great because you can effectively do what you like without worrying about privacy laws. But everything to the right of that, if you like, is going to be personal data, and that then brings in frame all kinds of responsibilities under things like the GDPR. And I guess if you take that to kind of your question was about surveillance, you know, concerns with things like these contact tracing apps, it's very interesting because all of them, to some extent, are going to rely on some degree of personal data. Now, you know, the sort of the key principles that, you know, all the key regulators are coming out with it says for these things to operate, they need to be able to identify ultimately an individual, because if I'm reporting proximity encounters with my neighbours or my friends, it has to relate ultimately back to me. Otherwise, it's of no use to the contact tracer when there's a problem downstream. So it ultimately relates to me. But what you absolutely should be doing is baking in, and we have this concept of privacy by design, baking into the design of the solution privacy principles, which are things like, well, so far as possible, minimize the amount of personal data that you collect. So we recognize it has to have a degree of personal data fields to it, otherwise it won't work, but minimize the amount. So in all the apps that you've been mentioning, the levels of personal data collected are really minimal. I mean, in almost all of them, they are encrypting data encounters. They are using codes which have no direct relationship back to an individual. So you couldn't look at the code and in any way sort of tie it back to a particular individual. It would link to a particular device and a phone, but you wouldn't know exactly which phone it was unless that individual decided to share that data with you. So, you know, the expectation is that you minimize the amounts of personal data. You don't collect any name, address details. You literally have a registration code, and then the contact information itself is shared in a way which, again, doesn't allow for one phone to really know which the other phone is. They know that the two are talking to each other. There's been an encounter, but unless effectively the key is planted in to unlock it and send an alert to say there's a problem, you know, neither user would ever know which other users it's been in contact with. So I'm kind of summarizing what is quite a complex set of technologies, but ultimately the designs are made in, you can minimize the levels of data and the nature of data collected for the thing to operate. And that's kind of a fundamental piece. There are other kind of really important pieces too. So trying to limit how much data is collected. So you only collect as much data as you need to do the contact tracing. So it might be tempting to collect a whole range of other information about diagnostic things or performance data. Really not, you know, the expectation is that's minimized as far as possible. Retaining data for only long as needed. So only keeping this data for as long as is necessary. There's a big debate about how long you keep it for, but in the UK, at least, they've been talking about, you know, only keeping data for, I think, 28 days. 28 days. That's the period of time within which, you know, from being asymptomatic right through to kind of someone logically being ill and reporting it is this sort of typical period of time. So you really shouldn't be needing to keep contact data for more than 28 days is the view here. And you know, only sharing data when you're absolutely necessary needs to happen. So lots of controls like that. And another really important one that we see with these apps, and there is a distinction here between different countries, is to what extent are they kind of mandatory or voluntary, by which I mean, are you required to download and use this app, or is it a voluntary thing? And it's back to you sort of said this at the beginning, you know, as an individual, many people I think want to support the wider public health benefits of contact tracing and supporting public health and allowing the economy to get back to work, if you like, by having a solution like this deployed. Others may be more skeptical. And so, you know, allowing people to make an informed decision about this, and informed comes back to the transparency piece of knowing what I'm signing up to, is really important. So, you know, another key feature of a lot of these solutions is making them just voluntary, allowing people to kind of opt out or delete them when they don't want to use them anymore, or if they feel uncomfortable. So there's a lot of kind of those sort of solutions baked in. But in other jurisdictions, there has been talk of some of them being made mandatory. So that clearly doesn't apply in some of the Western democracies that we're talking about. But there is a debate ethically there about, is this so important you have to make it mandatory and everyone has to use it? And if you don't, sort of pain of sufferance, the sort of impact. We're operating in a legal and regulatory environment which is not like that. It's certainly more on the voluntary side, but tied into that, all those protections about minimisation, retention, security, transparency about what's happening, giving people the opportunity to change their options downstream.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because a part of the debate about this surveillance state and the possibility of using these apps to control the population also relates to a potential trade-off considered between privacy and effectiveness. So some researchers sort of think that the effectiveness of these apps is only going to be proven if we make the whole population participate, if we make it mandatory. And like you were saying, that seems to trump privacy concerns as well. So in this sense, do you think that extreme circumstances call for what in normal times we would consider as legally or ethically dubious, or is the existence of an emergency state not enough justification by itself to make any type of privacy violation or intrusion legitimate?
Yeah, I think it's it's not a legal question, it's an ethical question, it's a philosophical one. But
yes.
I'm very clear in my thinking. First of all, I'd say I think all of these solutions, if you follow the principles I've just said about being transparent to people, bringing them on this journey with you, explaining why it's important, explaining how you've built in trusted technologies into the solution to protect their rights and interests and make them feel comfortable about it, you will achieve all those goals. So you will build trust, you'll get engagement, you'll get the outcomes, and you'll have a successful, strong society in response to this. I think if you assume that the user is stupid and ill-informed and doesn't need to have that level of engagement, and the only real answer to this is making it mandatory, and then you go down the road of not explaining things to people, you fundamentally are not trusting your population in that environment. I think you are dealing with a very different type of governmental structure then, aren't you? Because you're sort of saying the relationship between society, the individual and the state is completely different. It's not one of trust. It's one of, you're subservient to us. You shall do what we tell you. And if you don't, you might find yourself locked in prison. But I guess, how do people respond to that? I mean, in some environments, look, I'm not going to prejudge North Korea, but some environments like that, people probably would just do that because that's the way that you've been brought up since birth. But if you tried to impose that in Western democracy like the UK, you will get a significant number of people who are clearly going to object to that, who may kind of take up arms. They may, and we've seen some of this in the US with the sort of response to far lesser issues around the pandemic response. So, the society we live in will not, beyond a certain point, tolerate some of this, and that will lead to a breakdown of trust in much more fundamental things than just an app or this technology. It will be about the relationship between government and society, which is a much more fundamental thing. So, of course, you could look to mandate it, but I think you have to understand who you're dealing with, and if you don't bring people on your journey, what the consequences of that are going to be. And in some environments, it's clearly going to be one where people are going to object and refuse or misuse it or not report, or so it will have consequences.
And I would like to ask you sort of more of a personal question in some sort of sense. These general issues that we have, this false sense of security, our reliance on technology has been questioned by a lot of people. So I always wonder, is technology always the answer? I mean, there could be other ways of approaching these type of issues. There could be another way of dealing with certain problems in society, and you being very close to these technological challenges, what do you think? Is technology always the answer?
So I don't think it's always the answer, no. I think it is part of the answer, but only if it's used and adopted sensibly. And with part of the data ethics forum, which we work together with the university on, and have lots of debates with some of the professors in the AI department and your department about kind of these issues. And to me, if you're designing a system and it's got algorithms and things like that built into it to support the solution, which looks on the face of it like it's going to solve some great conundrum, I'm always delighted that the technology is out there to make the world a better place, or to innovate and to make improvements to our ways of working as society, whatever it might be. But I think a healthy dose of skepticism is also really important, because we need to make sure we haven't lost the human connection. We need to understand fundamentally how these things operate, and understand what there are always going to be downsides. There's always going to be risks. Where I struggle with some of these technology solutions is where people implement them blindly because they have such great faith in the technology. They don't, and are not willing to kind of consider the potential risks and address them. So I think if you follow the technology blindly, you end up ultimately with, in some cases, of course, you get some great outcomes, but often you hit a brick wall at some point and you go backwards. I think if you can engage sensibly with people who, particularly in the privacy world, understand and can challenge you on some sensible issues about, well, do we know how this operates? Do we understand what people's concerns might be about this? Do we understand the potential risks of bias or discrimination or whatever else it might be? And let's bake an effective response of that into the solution itself. And then let's make sure when we roll this thing out, we're getting proper engagement with people, explaining what's going on. And then let's make sure that once it's being implemented, we've got effective governance to make sure that inevitably there will be glitches or things that go wrong, that we're picking those up, we're open about them, we're going to respond to them, we're going to refine this, we're going to make it better, we're going to explain it to people. All of these things build trust. And so, any technology is only as good as it's the trusted environment in which it's being operated, back to that kind of example of the train. And so people need to have confidence that this works and understand inevitably there's some risks, but let's not hide them away. Let's explain how we're dealing with them, and let's move forward with that, rather than seeing technology in and of itself is a panacea without being honest about or taking the time to explore and look at these other issues.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this tiny discussion. I think it's been great. We have highlighted the value of trust, how it relates to transparency, and that ultimately the responsibility of how we deal with these technologies, the cybersecurity issues, or any other related ethical dilemmas we might face have to do with accessibility, have to do with that transparency, and how important it is to maintain trust and to build it from design. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. No, thank you so much.
This is all for this episode. Thank you for listening, and until next time. The Idea Pod is produced by the Interdisciplinary Ethics Applied Center at the University of Leeds. Find out more at www.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Music composed and conducted by Josh Armitage.